Hello, I'm Katrina Navikas. My email is k.navikas@hearts.ac.uk, and I'm going to tell you the sorts of things that I research and give you some pointers to some more specific projects that you might want to think about for a dissertation and that I'd love to supervise with you. So I work on the history of protest and popular politics, so democratic movements, social rights movements, um, and particularly looking at England and regions in England. How do people protest in the 18th and 19th centuries? How did the democratic movement develop? The campaign for the vote, the campaign for workers' rights. Thinking about those sorts of issues, there's plenty of sources and plenty of material that hasn't been dug up yet. And I stress that the more specific you are in your questions and your focus, I think the more rich material you'll find and the more analysis you'll be able to do in your projects. So think local, think regional. Often you can look at a big topic that has quite a lot of literature already about it, but find some new material and original ideas looking at how it applies in a local or regional setting. So there might have been already lots of books about your particular topic, but if you look at it locally or regionally, often you'll be able to compare and contrast between what the existing historiography has already said and your own findings. So often the best dissertations are very focused on particular sources, and I think looking locally, looking regionally is one of the best ways of doing that, and making sure that you're focused from the start. So think about, might be your local town, it might be your local region, it might be a region that you're familiar with. What sources can you find for that particular area in that particular topic? Another big project I'm working on at the moment is a history of public space in England over a long period, over three centuries. And by public space, I'm looking at open space mainly, so parks, squares, streets, anywhere that people regard as public. And I'm looking at questions over how do people use those spaces. So it might involve crime, it might involve play and leisure, it might involve protest, it might involve shopping consumerism, a social history of these public spaces, but also thinking about how they've been contested over time. Who owns that land? What happens if someone tries to build something on a playing field, for example, or a landowner decides to enclose a common? So thinking about those issues might be interesting to you. Everyone belongs somewhere, everyone has an attachment to a particular place. You might want to think about studying the history of open space or public space or national parks and nature reserves in your area. My final current project that I'm working on with some other colleagues is rural modernism. So this is me moving into the 20th century. And our project is on modernist structures, that is from the post-war 1950s, 1960s, 70s era in a rural environment. So big infrastructure that's often made out of steel and concrete. So it's kind of environmental history. It's looking at the impact on the environment, but it's also social history, looking at the impact on local communities. So big structures like power stations, nuclear power stations, gas holders, TV antennas. So you might be interested in the history of broadcast, for example, on television or radio, or the history of communications, motorways and railways. What impact have those big structures had on the infrastructure of the UK and the societies who live by them? So here are some potential research topics, and these are specific questions. You can adapt them as you want, but as I said, it's best to be specific from the start. So you might be interested in the history of protest and political meetings. Where did they happen in your town or your region? Did they change over time? How did different campaigns use protest? And what was the government's attitude to protest? So there's plenty of sources that I'll explain in a minute that are related to that question. Second one might be about land ownership. So maps and land records are very rich in looking at who owns the land. Is it one big landowner or lots of different landowners? How does that change over time? What's the effect of enclosure on land in your particular town or region? Is there a common that gets enclosed? Is there resistance to that? There's plenty of really interesting new material on commons and enclosure at the moment that you might want to pick up from. New towns and garden cities. You might be from one of the garden cities in Hertfordshire, you might be from one of the new towns. So there's plenty of untapped material in places like Hertfordshire Archives, Stevenage Museum, Milton Keynes Discovery Centre. They've got plenty of material, both in terms of archive material, photographs, models. You might be interested in how town planning worked in the 20th century. But increasingly, there's new interest in the social history of new towns. So, what happens to the new residents who moved there from the East End of London? How did they build their own identity in these places that are built from scratch? Another question might be related to the rural modernism one. How did new communications, such as electricity, radio, TV, roads, railways, change Britain in the 20th century? And finally, the environmental question. How did different groups protect their local environment? You might be interested in the history of parks, nature reserves, national parks, conservation, preservation. If those of you thinking about heritage, that's a really good question to think about. And what's the relationship between these movements and politics at the time? And so types of sources. There's a wealth of sources increasingly that we can access online, but also I do encourage you to go to your local studies libraries, county record offices, archives to dig around and find them. But there's plenty of material on politics, the maps. I do think that maps are really underused resource that historians can use to show change over time in particular areas. There's posters, political meetings posters, there's correspondence. So 19th century newspapers are often the best place to start if you're interested in political meetings and protest in the 19th century or any types of events that occur. Really good way, and one that is a ground methodology for me is building a database using the local newspapers. So going through the local newspapers, you can get them access to the British Library collection through Canvas. So you can build a database of places and events using local newspapers. The National Archives have quite a lot of material now that you can download for free, particularly Home Office correspondence. So they're big PDF files of correspondence between the local areas and the Home Office about political events that are happening. So you might be interested in using that, and it's completely underused. It's one of those sources that is there for you to get for free, but very few people use it. So I highly recommend you think about using that. I can show you how to download them and use them. British Library, if you want to look at original newspapers and magazines, the newspaper room is very user-friendly now, and you can look at the originals of anything you want to, really, any newspaper published in Britain and abroad from the British Library. But as I said, you can also access a lot of them online now. But I would encourage you to be adventurous and go to your local studies library or your county record office, which is where the county archives are kept. These often have quite miscellaneous boxes, and I've been doing a lot of tours of them recently, and they've got lots of beige boxes of material that, again, is very underused and is quite quick and easy to find. You just get these big boxes, often they're on open shelves, that are just miscellaneous topics. So you might want to pick the one on parks, for example, or the one on protest meetings, and there'll be a box and you can just flip through it, and whatever they've collected about it you can sort and try and contextualize and put in the bigger picture. And they often have lots of collections of maps, of historic maps that you could use as well. So do use your local studies library and your county record office, because often they've have got very helpful archivists as well who can help you find what you're looking for. As long as you start with a particular question, you've got to know what you're trying to find when you go there. Another useful source, and again is mostly online now, are local image collections. Most local county record offices and local studies are now put a lot of their collections online, photographs. I've just put two that I've been using recently, the Lambeth Landmark collection, the London Metropolitan Archives collage collection. So a huge range of photographs, and again, an underused resource, visual resources for looking at places and change over time.